Hi, everyone, and thanks for being here in spirit virtually tonight. It's nice to see so many familiar faces and some new ones, and I'm going to try to keep it to 15 minutes because I think the question periods are always more fun. So we'll go ahead and dive in here. So a lot of people aren't overly familiar with lead seals. Even archaeologists kind of view them as a mystery sometimes. But essentially, lead seals are small metallic lead tags that were used to track information on various products. I have an example of some of the products that they've been used for in more modern times on the next slide. A lot of people in texts on the fur trade and in archaeology will refer to lead seals as bale seals. But that's somewhat of a misnomer because although some seals were used to mark bales of goods, a lot of the time it doesn't appear that they were attached to bales that were used in the fur trade that were in canoes. It's much more often, almost always, lead seals are lead cloth seals, which were attached to textiles. So they're really valuable sources of information because those textiles tend to degrade in the ground over time and we kind of lose them. So the lead seals are able to give us back that information on textiles and let us know a little bit about the more ephemeral parts of the past. Usually, lead cloth seals mark information concerning the quality of textiles, the measure and dimensions of textiles, and usually that's by textile piece. Lead seals were almost always attached to a piece, which is sort of an expansive textile as it comes off of the loom. So you can kind of think of it as similar to like a modern day bolt of fabric. So you walk into Joann's, there's all the bolts of fabrics. That one bolt is kind of sort of a piece. It's an easy way to picture it because dimensions varied in France from region to region. So there wasn't a whole lot of standardization until after the revolution. In addition to recording information on the dimensions and quality of textiles, lead seals contain really valuable information in their impressions that relate back to the producers of textiles and the merchants that made textiles circulate through the system and enabled them to pass on to consumers, in this case, consumers at Fort St. Joseph. One thing I do want to mention, because I get this question a lot, lead cloth seals were usually just attached to raw cloth, so just your bolts that aren't made into anything. There are some rare exceptions that were probably attached to types of clothing, like in particular stockings. You'll find seals that have been identified as stocking seals, but in general, we're talking about just lengths of textile that, are blank canvases to create all sorts of dress that reflect different identities and different cultures and that you can kind of play with. So here's some examples of more modern uses for lead seals. We have one that is marking a reproduction amphorae for the tourist trade. And I think that I have not done a whole lot of in-depth research on that, but I think it's to signal to customs that it's a reproduction and not an antiquity being smuggled. We have guano seals. So guano is used as fertilizer, and those show up kind of all over the place. There's a lot of them found in England, actually. So the guano seal is the one with the sort of cornucopia on the right-hand side. There are lead seals that mark authentic antique Persian rugs, usually have them. And kind of a more modern spin on it that isn't necessarily lead is that Certified Seed Illinois Crop Improvement Association seal in the middle. So you can see that the idea of lead seals, even though they're not necessarily made in lead, has kind of continued on in some cases. And I do know that commercial businesses and like the military still use lead seals to to track information on shipments and to make sure that there's no tamper there, because lead seals are very tamper proof. Like if you try to tear it off, you'll be able to tell because the lead is so soft, which is exactly why that material has been used for ages and ages. So getting back to Fort St. Joseph, which is the reason we're all here. there are a number of seals that have been recovered from Fort St. Joseph. And that is, some of them have been archaeologically recovered by the field school. And there are a bunch of them that were found in the past and then donated to museums. So they don't have that nice tight context you get from archaeological work. So we can't really pinpoint where they come from in the fort. We can't say that they were found inside a structure. We can't say they were found in a midden, but we can say they probably, more than likely, came from the site. So I've kind of looked at those and drawn information from those to tell us more about what might have been at Fort St. Joseph. And a lot of my undergraduate thesis focused on identifying types of textiles that were pinpointed by the seals. So I was looking at the seals and working backwards to try to find out what sort of textiles were present at Fort St. Joseph and how they might have been used. But since then, I've been kind of gradually shifting in my research towards understanding the connections that lead seals reveal. So not only am I interested in the textiles, but I'm interested in who made the textiles, who used the textiles, who made the textiles available to consumers, who inspected the textiles, who attached the seals, who mined the lead that went into the seals, because all of that information is kind of bundled up in seals. So we can kind of pick apart that information looking at the seal and looking at historical documents. So as I said, I'm looking more at connections, and I'm sort of using network theory as a way to do that. So it's basically thinking about interactions between people and the different paths that people and objects take through networks. A lot of us are familiar with Fort St. Joseph as a fur trading post, first and foremost. And we think, okay, this is something that's the edge of empire, it's the middle of nowhere. People come out here to trade with Native Americans, and it's sort of isolated. But looking at the lead seals, you can see that really Fort St. Joseph is part of a huge system. And what happens at Fort St. Joseph and throughout New France, the northern part of New France, ripples back to Europe. So people in France are experiencing things that are the results of what is going on in New France, particularly those people who are commercially connected with New France. So when I talk about the fur trade and the provisioning of goods to Canada, I like to think of it as the Canada trade. And the Canada trade is a term that is derived from Le Traite du Canada, which shows up in period documents as a way of referring to the commerce between northern New France and France. So it has been adapted in English and used by a few people writing about trade between the two. So I tend to go with Traite du Canada because that includes both things being imported for consumption by colonists and things that are being imported for the specific reason of trade with Native Americans and the maintenance of alliances and the going on and the carrying on of the fur trade. So as objects, lead seals inform us on those interactions between people and things, like I was saying. They have sort of layers of interactions that are waiting to be unpacked using historical documents and the impressions. So they're sort of like onions. Like you'll peel back one layer and you're like, okay, this had to have come through Quebec. There's a layer. Peel back another layer. Okay, it probably left from this port. Peel back another layer. This merchant probably sent it from here because we can see that textile is being made there and the merchant's name is on the seal. So there's all this different information that's contained in that one object. So it's almost kind of got a collection, like a cumulative chunk of memory, historical memory of where it's been and what it's been part of. So they're very interesting in that way. They're also very interesting because the material of lead allows it to be manipulated through impression. So you can have different dyes and different stamps that have different designs, and those designs reflect information on the people who are creating the seals, who are using the seals, and they can also sort of make us pose interesting questions about how those signs were interpreted by other people. So You know, if you have a sign that is very specific to a community. One of the towns in France that I'm studying has a willow tree as its emblem, the emblem of the town. And when you see that willow tree and you're from that town, you're like, oh, it's our town's willow tree symbol. But when that goes across miles and miles and changes cultures, you kind of have to think, well, how are people who have always been in North America, who aren't necessarily part of that culture, of that small community in France, how are they perceiving that symbol? So it leads to interesting archaeological questions. So because it would take hours and hours and days for me to tell you about every single seal from Fort St. Joseph, as much as I would really love to do it, I'm going to focus on just a few of the ones that I find more revealing about the connections and that kind of show us how connected Fort St. Joseph is to everything else going on. So the seals being found at Fort St. Joseph have these trails that lead back to France. So I'm going to illuminate the other side of lead seals and the other side of the Canada trade tonight. So here's one of our seals from Fort St. Joseph, and this is actually a seal from Carcassonne, which is, I have a map in the next slide, so you'll have to wait to know where Carcassonne is. But it's in sort of southern France, in what we call the French Midi, which is sort of the middle of southern France. And a lot of people know it because it has these really romantic turrets that are completely not historical to the place because they were installed in the 19th century by early historic preservationists. But it's this huge complex of walls, and this fortress has been around since the Romans, basically, when the Romans were in France still. So it's very old, and it's this place with a lot of layers. So a lot of people go there for the cité and the medieval stuff, but the rest of the town has all of these houses where these merchants creating textiles in Carcassonne lived. So I was able to go and visit some of those when I was over there for research in 2019. But what's interesting about the seal is it's specifically marking something that was made in Carcassonne, and it's marking a drap. So a drap is a type of wool textile, and it's a thicker wool textile that has kind of a fuzzy raised nap on it, so it's soft and it holds warmth and it's slightly water repellent. And a lot of drap was being traded in the fur trade, actually, so the Canada trade and everything. A lot of Native Americans were interested in acquiring drap to make into clothing. So we see the Huron couple that I have on this PowerPoint and how they're employing textiles that would have possibly been made in Carcassonne. And we have a really great eyewitness account from Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, who was the aide-de-camp for the Marquis de Montcalm, who's the sort of the major general of the French forces in the French and Indian War. And he says that he brings up Carcassonne and the woollens being made there several times, actually. He says, oh, you know, the Company of the Indies that has a monopoly on the fur trade, that imports everything for us, are trying to give they're trying to trade with the natives with the specific drap that we have coming from France that are from Carcassonne, and they don't want it. So instead we have to import English ones that are imitations that don't work as well. And the natives won't trade with us because we don't have the correct type of cloth. And he mentions, you know, Carcassonne really should try harder to have a better black band on them and to have better colors, because these Native Americans are very, very particular about their textiles because they're very savvy consumers and they know what is good quality and what is not. So it's interesting to think that some stuff from Carcassonne made it to Fort St. Joseph, and we don't know if it was the good stuff or the bad stuff or somewhere in between or when it came over, unfortunately, because lead seals are sort of notoriously hard to date because they can sit in storerooms for years and years. And even, you know, if you know it's coming from a place, Carcassonne has a textile industry that goes back to at least the Middle Ages. So to pinpoint that without any indication of date on the seal and without a whole ton of comparative examples is really difficult. So I did go to Carcassonne when I was over there, and I found where some of the textiles in Carcassonne was being made. So this is one of the buildings, a big factory, And it used to be the royal factory until the French Revolution. So you can see where the word royal has been sort of etched out. So Carcassonne is on the map right there for you. We're in southern France, and you can see I've also highlighted La Rochelle, Rochefort, and Bordeaux, which are some of the main ports in the south of France that we're shipping out to New France. At least the ones that I have been looking at primarily. And if we move to our next location, Masmé, it's a little bit north of Carcassonne, but Masmé has the highest number of seals at Fort St. Joseph. So there's a lot of that being consumed at the site, and we're not entirely sure by who, but we know it's there. And Masmé is actually a twill woven molten cloth, and it's a little bit lighter. It has a light nap on it. So it's almost like a flannel without the fuzz and maybe a little bit thinner. So some of these textiles are a little bit hard to pinpoint exactly what they were because of the way in which we talk about historical textiles and the way in which people in history talk about textiles. Like you could look up a twill woven molten in a dictionary at the time and you can get 17 different types of twill woven molten. It's different, things are named by location, so it's a little tricky to nail down what exactly these textiles were sometimes. So we have seals that are from the Inspection Bureau in Masmé that are, you know, stating that whatever was produced there is of the correct quality to be circulated in other parts of France and to go to Canada. And you can see the rooster there is the root, actually a city symbol for Masmé also. So it helps because whenever you see a rooster, you can usually attribute that seal to Masmé. Also, we have one that has Pulch on it, P-U-L-C-H, which might be an abbreviation of Latin or Occitan for beautiful or fine. So it's sort of one of those quality markers we see on seals occasionally. So Masmé is actually very interesting because there are a lot, like other towns in the south of France, it was really heavily impacted when Canada was lost to the English for a second, because the English did start pulling some stuff from France because of the demand. But the textile industries that were really booming at the height of New France sort of trickled off and disappeared after 1759, and entire communities sort of got pulled under by the loss of that Canadian market. So next we're going to go to Montauban, which is a little bit more to the west, and this was sort of the previous focus of my dissertation. I've had to change a little bit because of COVID, unfortunately, but I was looking specifically at seals from Montauban because they show up on every single site that I have looked at for New France, from Nova Scotia all the way to like Indiana. I know that they're present at all the sites, and usually they're seals of a specific merchant family, the Mariette family. So Montauban is very, very interesting because it's singled out in a lot of documents as sort of one of the great centers of the Canada trade. And looking through documents in the archives there, I even saw a lot of people that were identifying themselves or that were listed in so they were listed in different books. They had signed different books as négociant canadien. So a négociant is basically an international scale merchant. So if you think of people who like have more risky international business, sort of like Prospero in The Merchant of Venice, who have things invested in different products from different places and trade internationally. That's what we're talking about in Montauban here, the négociant. But the fact that they're identifying themselves as Canadian merchants in this case, even though they lived in France their entire life, they are Canadian merchants. You can see how much the Canada trade was a factor in their personal identity and how they were part of the Canada trade, and it was very important to their wealth and their status in their community. And most of the merchant families in Montauban were multi-generational family dynasties that often intermarried to fuse businesses together and to accumulate wealth. And as a result of that intermarriage and that accumulation of wealth and that merging together of fortunes, when one of the merchants lost everything because of the fall of Canada, most of the other merchants got pulled down with him. So also, an interesting thing about Montauban is that it's sort of a hotbed for Protestantism in France, which is, of course, in the 18th century, like highly Catholic. So there's this Protestant tradition there, and Protestantism is sort of a trend that runs throughout the Canada trade. There are a lot of Protestants involved in the Canada trade. So one of my things that I really wanted to explore was like the connection between religion and the formation of ties in the Canada trade. If everybody who is Protestant has business partners that are Protestant, you know, how are those people communicating that religious identity to each other? Is it because they're family, or can you communicate it to somebody who's outside of your family? And how do the lead seals play a role in that? So Montauban also produced textiles. Cadzi and Monton were actually the main products, especially Cadzi. That's the one that everybody there locally still remembers. They're like, oh, we supplied all of these Cadzi woolens to Canada back in the day, and we're still really proud of it. So it's really interesting to visit there. And they also trade textiles from throughout the Midi of France. So they were sort of the people who were shipping it up to the ports from elsewhere in the heartland. And the seal right there, actually, interestingly, has been identified as men in a canoe, but it's actually men in a rowboat if you look closely at other examples. So it's just another example of how these motifs can be interpreted differently depending on what area of the world you live in and what culture you're a part of. Because as a fur trade archaeologist, you'll look at that and say, hey, it's a canoe. But looking at it from a French point of view, it's a rowboat being used on one of the rivers in France or on the Canal du Midi to ship it elsewhere. Okay. So here's kind of a view of some of the merchant houses in Montauban. So you can see that entire row right there is all merchant houses along the river there, the Tarn. The Tarn River was used for dyeing and for transportation of textiles. And one of the arrows on the arrow on the left is actually the merchant family that is related to the seal I just showed you, and they lived in the Mariette Oriel house. So everything from these places eventually goes out through La Rochelle, Rochefort, or Bordeaux. Rochefort was the military port, so anything that was supplying troops in New France would probably go through Rochefort. There are really good records of that I was able to check out in Quebec. A lot of the La Rochelle is one of those hotbeds of Protestantism, so a lot of the connections for Protestant merchants elsewhere in France are those Protestants in La Rochelle that then send it to New France to their Protestant connections in New France. So it's kind of interesting to see that, once again, that chain of religion. When they got to a port, the seals were all kind of bundled together, and it would be opened, and the textiles would be bundled together, and that bundle would be opened, and all the seals on it would be checked for accuracy and to make sure that the textiles were fine. And if the textiles weren't fine, occasionally you see the seals betray the people that they're meant to represent. So seals are sort of a three-dimensional signature, the way I'm looking at them. They're a guarantee of quality. And when that seal is attached to a textile that is found to be faulty, the people referenced by that seal are in for trouble. Basically, they were prosecuted, there were fees, you could be sent to the galley if it was a repeat offense. So it was pretty serious stuff that, in a way, these seals have this power over people sometimes in these interactions, just by the sheer, just by what they have in their impressions, they can point out someone to be prosecuted. So once again, everything goes on the ships to New France. There are some Bordeaux customs seals at Louisbourg. Louisbourg is the only site, well, not the only site, there's a couple sites, because Montreal has some too, that have actual bale seals that I think were attached to these larger packages. And we can get into that at question period, because I know I'm running a little bit over time. So once again, once things get to Fort St. Joseph, we have to think about how seals and textiles were viewed differently from in France. So the seal on the screen right here is from Nimes in France, and the symbol on it is actually supposed to be a crocodile chained to a palm tree, and it was a symbol of the city created by Augustus Caesar's troops that had just beat Cleopatra at the sea battle at Actium. So that crocodile is Egypt and Cleopatra suppressed and chained to a palm tree. But on this side of the Atlantic, if you had never seen a crocodile and you ran into the seal and you weren't from Nimes and you weren't French, how would that be perceived then? It's one of those questions that I would like to get more into sometime. So in conclusion, we have seen tonight that lead seals from Fort St. Joseph reconnect the fort to larger early modern global trade networks. More importantly, reconnect these microhistories, these interactions between people, these merchants, these places, and the textiles back to the fort. And they kind of deepen our understanding of the world around Fort St. Joseph. And so I hope that from this presentation, some of you are interested more in lead seals and that you're excited to learn more yourself about lead seals and how they inform us on connections as well as consumption. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation and I'm ready for questions.
Okay, Catherine, so thank you so much. This was great. I have a couple in the queue, but first I kind of want to start off with a general question about how did you become interested in studying lead seals?
So actually, to start with, I wasn't terribly interested in them. I was really interested in how things were packaged in the fur trade. So I wanted to know about bales and like what goes into a bale, how do people move bales around, how does shipping and packaging work in the fur trade? And Dr. Nassani actually suggested, hey, you know, people haven't done a lot of research into lead seals. You could research lead seals. And I was like, yeah, I suppose I could. And you could research lead seals. I'm like, okay, I'll research lead seals. And he definitely spurred me on this path that I've been on since. And I couldn't be happier because they're really interesting and they get so little attention that I've had a lot of work to do, but it's been incredibly rewarding. When you find a match for the merchant name on your seal, or you find out what a symbol means, it's just this feeling of discovery that you don't get often.
Okay, so our first question beyond that, I'm really glad also that you started going down this path and that he pushed you because it's turned into this great career for you. So one person wants to know about lead seals and forgery. Okay, so with lead being such a soft metal, do you know if there was any evidence of forgery or manipulation of the seals?
Actually, I have found some interesting accounts in France, some actual government slaps on the wrist for people who were forging lead seals or removing lead seals and attaching them to different textiles. So kind of faking other lead seals. I have one example from southern France where merchants were attaching fake English lead seals to their woolens because they thought they could get more if people thought it was English because the English stuff was of higher quality at that point in time. So that has happened, and there's you know an official regulation from the government saying you shall not attach fake English seals to your wool. And there's actually a really interesting case of a couple towns in northern France, sort of to the west of Paris, where they were kind of playing dirty and trying to outcompete each other by taking like junky runs of cloth and putting the seal to the opposing town on it. So there's also a little bit of backlash from the government about that, saying, hey, stop doing this. Nobody's enjoying the junky cloth. Stop framing each other. Just produce good stuff and put the correct textile seals on it, or we're going to come after you.
That's funny. So I think I've got a couple more specific questions and then I have some general ones. So let's take some general ones and then we'll go into the specific. So can you say more about the molds and the raw material for them, how they were made, how lead seals were made?
Yeah, so in terms of raw material, the lead that was being used at the time is like not necessarily the lead that's being used in things today. So like if you were to try to make lead seals now using like fishing weights, it's not the right kind of lead. So you have to have a very soft lead. sort of, I think that some softer lead is used in repairing like leaded windows, like that have the lead pieces that hold the glass panes in on older windows. But it's closer to pure, and it's not as much of an alloy as the stuff we use today. And in terms of the molds, there's actually relatively few that have been found. I myself know of one lead seal mold, and it's shown in Jeff Egan's book on seals and related items in the British Museum from the 90s. And I had a quick sketch of that on the first slide I did on lead seals, where everything was a line drawing. And they're usually bivalve molds, but I think they could have been made using a single mold. But there's sort of a lot more to research to do on, you know, production of these, certainly. And I am also very interested in the sealing process, because you get so many seals that have stamps that are like half off of the seal, that are not entire, that are partial, and it kind of makes you wonder how many pieces a day these people were sealing, and how monotonous that task was to be, you know, hammering seals on pieces left and right, to the point where you're no longer making sure your stamp is lined up. So there's a lot of little glimpses into daily life of people who are involved in the production of circulation of seals that, you know, archaeology certainly can help us address. At least it can raise those questions.
So that goes into the next question of how are they closed? So they want to know a little bit more information about that. Is there specific tools that they would use? Are the seals placed on an anvil and then struck with a hammer? And then how is the design kind of put on the seal as well? So,
yeah, so actually sealing is probably best compared to like older techniques of coin making, where you have a stamp and a die, and the die is usually set into an anvil. The seal is placed between the two and then struck. So that's kind of basically how it's done. Sometimes you find clamps for lead seals, but usually that's for like smaller like numbers, if you're going to add numbers on top of an impression, or if you're going to add a specific tiny sign on it that signifies a certain quality, or, you know, sort of smaller things like that. I've seen that have, because there are examples of clamps in museums. There's examples of stamps and dies in some European museums mostly.
Okay. All right, the next one is what would cause the coloring in the seals? So I'm not sure if they're referring to the picture or just coloring in general, but go ahead.
So I've actually seen lead seals of a lot of colors, and
Okay.
the color it depends sometimes on sort of the conditions of the site and the interaction of, you know, chemicals at the site with the lead. But usually what this has been, the different colors lead seals has been attributed to is different metals in the alloy. So depending on what metals are mixed with the lead, because none of these are like pure lead, because, you know, lead refining wasn't exactly like, it would get you close to pure, but you'd still have some sort of residual ones in it, or some could have been added even to make it maybe stiffer or to change the properties of it. So depending on what the chemical content of the lead alloy is, you'll have different colors show up. And once again, those react differently with conditions at the site to give you different colors. I've seen white, I've seen red, I've seen orange, I've seen gray. So it's really, they're strangely colorful for what they are.
So kind of talking about different environmental types of at sites, does the lead cause any environmental problems? Either at the sites where they're kind of recovered from, or at the sites where they're being processed or made?
At the sites where they were being made, there was probably some problems. So I've done a little bit of research on lead poisoning and historic lead poisoning, just because it's of interest to me, because I'm interested in the lives of people who were working with lead at the time. And I think the people who were most at risk were probably the people who were mining and refining the lead, because lead is most toxic when it's airborne particles and when it's lead oxide. So what makes lead really dangerous is chemical reactions with other substances. So metallic lead is actually the safest form of lead. You don't, like, molten lead and airborne particles are really, really bad for you. Metallic lead isn't so bad unless it oxidizes. So if it's exposed to something with a different pH, it'll cause lead oxide to form, and lead oxide is what is incredibly toxic to people. And that is a bad way to go. You actually have historic cases of rum stills in the Caribbean that had lead components in the tubing, and it would actually cause the rum that was produced in the stills to take on lead oxides. So the people consuming too much rum or too much wine at the time, because actually lead oxide was used as an artificial sweetener. So when you have Splenda now, Splenda is actually based on the taste of lead oxide, which was the first artificial sweetener. So it's because lead is very sweet. That's why you don't paint things in lead that kids are going to play with, because it's sweet and they'll be attracted to that. So, but when you absorb that, that's when it was the most dangerous. So you had all of these enslaved workers on these plantations in Barbados that were getting the dry bellyache, which is lead poisoning, and a lot of them actually died of it because of the way these stills for rum were set up. So that's a little bit of it. As far as the impact on sites, there's a lot of sites and a lot of lead in the world, and you know, it's hard to tell. It would be interesting to see what the impact is, but there's so much lead in the ground everywhere from all of human history that I think, especially in Europe, it would be a bigger problem, because there's even more lead. You know, you can go out in any given field and find tons of lead chunks everywhere. In the UK, certainly, it seems. So it's probably not good, but it's the world we live in. So maybe archaeology is cleaning it up seal by seal.
So the next one, it kind of looks into a little bit about, can you tell if we did metallurgy where the lead seals are coming from in Europe? Would you be able to determine that, or do you really rely on the stamps?
So this is interesting. This is a question that a lot of people have asked me, and I have never used lead sourcing, because when you do that, you're finding out where the lead came from, but you're not finding out where the seal came from. And it's especially tricky with France, because France has very few lead mines. So the majority of lead coming into France, we know from historic documents, is actually coming from Germany or elsewhere on the continent, or from the UK. So we have an idea of where the lead is coming from. So we could, if we wanted, source it to a specific deposit, but it wouldn't help us know where the seal is from. So that's why the impressions are so important. And, you know, when you don't get a well-preserved seal, you're like, rats, we might never know where that one comes from. And even if you tested it for lead sourcing, it would just tell you where the lead came from, which is also interesting, though, because, like I said, I'm really interested in how these lead seals and the lead in the seals interacted with people. So those miners who are absorbing lead, who are getting sick and lead poisoned, it's interaction with lead. It's an interaction of people and things in history. So, yeah.
That is really interesting. So one person is curious about the types of seals that are predominant at FSJ. So they say, obviously, French lead seals are probably predominant, but what other seals from other countries have been found? Do you know?
So there's a few sort of late 18th century lead seals from England that turn up, but since they're not ones that have been really archaeologically excavated, it's a little hard to tell were those dropped at the site at a later date. You know, it's kind of unclear how close the connection to the site is with those, especially since the dates can kind of vary. Like I have some that were pushing into the 1820s. So it's you know, depending on what phase of history at the site you're looking at, yeah, there's some different ones out there, but most of the ones that are for sure French and from the 18th or that are for sure from the 18th century and around the time period that the fort would have been most active are definitely French. There's very, very few from other places, and that's probably because the French were control freaks and they really only wanted their colony trading with them. So, you know, a lot of British goods were contraband, and strangely enough, I don't see a whole lot of seals that I can attribute to contraband British goods. So, you know, I suppose if you're smuggling contraband British goods, you probably pop the seals off ahead of time so you don't get caught, is my thought, or you try to fake French ones. But catching counterfeit seals is a whole other thing, because you have to know, you know, exactly what the stamps that produce the seals looked like and how the counterfeit would look different. And seals were also updated fairly regularly. So every couple of years, they would come out with a new stamp to prevent counterfeiting.
So what would they do with the seals once they reach the fort? Would they repurpose them for anything? Have you seen evidence of that?
Yeah. So seals, I think a lot of them are probably getting melted down, but a lot of them are also getting repurposed into whizzers. I've seen some that have been, you know, kind of smushed down and had holes punched through them, and the edges are cut up into whizzers, you know, the little buzzsaw kind of toy things. So there must have been a lot of bored people at Fort St. Joseph. And also, I think I've seen one that looks like it might have had sort of like an arrow point shape cut out of it. I don't know if that's actually for an arrow point, because I don't think that would have been incredibly effective since lead is so soft, but it's something to consider. And I think some of them are used as weights, either for clothing or yeah, with those it's hard to tell. I've been meaning to do some stuff on like clothing weights versus fishing weights versus other weights, because you find all these lead artifacts where it's just a disc with 2 holes in the middle, and you're like, looks like it would be a really boring whizzer. A lot of people identify them as clothing weights or coat weights, and that's something I'd like to look into, because a lot of stuff just kind of gets tucked in with the coat weights. So a lot of the times I've gone to sites to look at lead seals, and they're tucked in with miscellaneous lead objects, so that with these round discs with 2 holes. So, but I suspect some probably got repurposed into whatever that is. Like I said, I think a lot of it ended up as shot of some sort, because you can produce like bird shot very quickly with very little, you know, all you need is like a colander or a bowl with holes punched in it, and you can make like Rupert shot. So I think, unfortunately, a whole lot of seals probably ended life that way at all different sites.
Do you know how much yardage would be in one of the package or the bales? Is there a standard, or is it kind of depending on what they need to ship?
So if we're talking about bales coming from France, I've seen some records of a shipwreck in Nova Scotia, and it had a little bit on like how things were packaged, and there seemed to be packets inside of the larger bales. So there's sort of subsections of textiles, and I think, based on what I've read, that there were probably like around 20 pieces per packet, and maybe like 5 packets in a bale. So it's stuff that I would need to look back at. And I think it definitely varies, because the size of pieces varies. So it makes sense if they're different sizes, they may or may not fit in the same amount of space. So that is a really good question. And I know that there's a lot more on like how much the English in the 18th century are how many pieces are going into a packet, and how many packets are in a bale, and what the assortment is. But with the French stuff, it's a little bit harder to pin down. So.
Okay, so let's go to Dave, who has his hand up, because I'm not sure if one of his questions has came in through here, and I don't want him to get missed because he's had his hand up for the entire Q&A. So I'm sure he's got a great question.
Okay.
So go ahead, and then Dave, if you want to unmute and tell us your question, that would be great. And then we'll take a few more after that, and we'll kind of wrap up.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure my question will be great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I was just kidding. Actually, a quick comment, then a quick question. I'm a retired chemist, and your comments about the color of the lead oxide, I didn't have a chance to do it while you were talking, but you may want to just do a Google crystallographic forms of lead oxide. There may be differences in the color of the different forms of lead. There may be more than one form of lead oxide. especially if it's impure. That may account for the color. That's kind of what you said anyway, I think. Anyway.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen that at play. I know that at most of the French sites I've seen, the lead oxide has been a little bit more on the white side. So I'm also always very, very careful to make sure that I'm not, like inhaling too much, or, I'm always washing my hands and being very careful around these. Of course, I'm not in there licking everybody's lead seals. But so I've seen that white color on a lot of the ones from French sites, but in some of the ones from Jamestown, I've actually seen this really vibrant red. There's little bits of really vibrant red, and I'm not sure if that's has something to do with their conservation process or with just differences in the environment down here in Virginia. So I think you're definitely
yeah, it depends, on the soil too. If there's chlorides or other materials in the soil that might react with the lead to form that. I may spend a little bit of time, since I'm retired, I got all the time in the world, so I may look into that tomorrow. If I find anything, I'll let you know.
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
My other quick question is, I know that you've looked at a lot of sites, and I know that Michilimackinac is probably one that you've looked at, and I know there was a publication there, I believe it was in the 80s, I don't remember the author who published about lead seals. So have you found any matches,
Diane
seals
Adams?
that you found at Michigan? Pardon me?
Diane Adams, I think, is the one who is publishing on lead seals.
Oh, right, okay,
yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I have read her work, and I'm kind of familiar with the ones she's seen, and there's a few that I have kind of attributed as misidentifications in some cases, because she was working heavily with British evidence, and she did a really great job, which is great because she was working with Jeff Egan, who was still alive at that time, and he was really the complete guru on everything lead seal. And unfortunately, I've been trying to figure out things that I'm sure he knew in his lifetime. But a lot of it is very heavily based on English evidence. So I think like her information on sealing practices and on how seals were used, I think draws a lot more from the English evidence, where for the French seals, a lot of things are the same, but a lot of things are different. Yeah, but in terms of seals, a lot of the seals actually do repeat. So it gets to the point where there's like a certain locations show up more often than others, and you're kind of better at identifying like little blips, like you have 3 letters of it and you're like, I know exactly where the seal came from because I've seen the whole impression on this other seal. So certainly I've used stuff that seals that she has identified and that Lyle Stone before her identified as well in his sort of compendium of artifacts.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I've got 3 more for you, okay? So one is, have any French seals turned up unexpectedly at other sites, either Spanish sites or British or Dutch colonial sites that you know of? Have you seen?
I've mostly worked on French sites. So Jamestown is the first like fully not really French site that I've worked on. But it has been interesting to see sort of how the Jamestown stuff varies, because what I'm seeing at least is a lot more seals from elsewhere besides the mother colony. So there's English seals there, but there's seals from all over continental Europe too. And you just don't really see that on French sites. But my sort of original dissertation pitch when I arrived in Williamsburg was, I want to do a comparative analysis of all of the sites in the Southeast, all of the French, all of the Spanish, all the English sites, and look for evidence of contraband and trading between enemy countries, essentially. I really wanted to sort of see that, to see what nationalities show up. And unfortunately, I've just sort of changed directions since then. So that's a project that could definitely be someone's master's or PhD. So
that brings into a nice transition for my next question. So how has COVID affected your research, and what are some of your goals going forward, if you could share it just briefly?
COVID has not been kind to me. It's caused a little bit of heartbreak, because a lot of my research for my dissertation really depended on me going to France and looking at archives. So in order to make sense of this stuff, I have to go and understand who the Mariette family was in Montauban and what Montauban was like back then, and how people identified, and like where people went to church and what the community was like. And, I can't necessarily access those archives now. I have sort of baptismal records, so I can do some of that, but I can't get a good grip on my other questions really without going there and going to archives all over France. So Bordeaux, you know, there's probably some in Paris I should see. There's some in Toulouse that I need to look at. And they're just kind of scattered all over the south of France. And I had just got into it in 2019. I went for like 2 weeks is all I had funding for. And I got over there and I got to go all these wonderful places and I started picking up tidbits. I went to the Customs Museum in Bordeaux and was just like completely blown away because there was a seal just like the one I had seen at Louisbourg just sitting there in a case. And I'm like, that's it. This is where it came from. So, you know, I had just dove into all this and started to find all the archives and the good spots to hit and the people to know. And then the doors all closed on me. And I can't get funding to travel abroad because nobody can travel abroad right now. And, you know, I'm kind of stuck at home. So unfortunately, I've had to transition from looking at the French material that I love so much to looking at something a little different. So now I'm working with a collection of over 300 seals from Jamestown Rediscovery, and I'm going to use what I've learned from the French stuff I've worked on to start to shed light on the connections that made the formative years of that colony possible. You know, because they were so reliant on things coming in from England those first couple of years that it'll be interesting to see what connections enabled this colony to form and how those can be traced back to the lead seals and what the lead seals can tell us that we maybe didn't know.
Great. So all of your kind of research and your interests, I know that you were interested in archaeology before you got involved with the project, but when you first came for that summer camp, what were your thoughts? Did you ever see it going this way? How did it kind of transform where your path was leading?
Yeah, so I have been interested in archaeology for basically as long as I can remember, but my primary interest when I showed up at Fort St. Joseph was, okay, I'm going to go into Egyptology, but I have to see if I like field work first. And this is going to help me find out if I like field work or not, because that's going to be the make it or break it thing. If I don't like field work, I just can't be an archaeologist, was my thought, which is completely untrue. You can be an archaeologist and not do field work. You know, you can work in collections, you can work with artifacts, but you should still know the basics, of course. So don't not take a field course, because it's very important to understand how that works to be able to make artifacts make sense. But that was sort of my mindset when I showed up at Fort St. Joseph was, you know, I'm gonna work on Egypt, but I'll learn here. And, you know, getting into sort of the training and some of the information they gave us as a camper, I started thinking like, yeah, this is kind of cool stuff. I forgot how much I like thinking about like the French in Michigan. Like I always thought the voyageurs were kind of cool, and you know, I could do this. And you know, after talking with some people, I was like, you know, I think this is a little bit more doable than Egyptology. It seems like it's a little bit more chill than Egyptology. It seems like there are more questions. Not that Egyptology doesn't have a lot of questions, but this is something that people don't talk about often. Why aren't people talking about this? You know, if you walk up to somebody in the grocery store in Michigan and say, hey, you know, 300 years ago, you would have been like speaking French for sure. Well, maybe not. Yeah, 300 about, you know, they look at you like you had 6 eyes sometimes, just because it's not something that people talk about often. You hear about Plymouth, you hear about Jamestown, but you don't hear about Father Marquette and St. Ignace. St. Ignace is incredibly old. So it's just, you know, I sort of realized that this was something that was closer to home. You know, it's Michigan, it's my home, and I could learn more about it by learning about the French, and I could bring this history to light for people.
So do you recommend your experience then? You had a great time, you would tell?
Absolutely, do it. It's a blast. You know, go as a camper. If you're a student, take the field school. Even if you're not an archaeologist, you'll learn something. You know, I had a pit partner when I was in field school who was a social worker. So, you know, but she knows all about archaeology now. And I think that thinking like an archaeologist and learning to think like an archaeologist is a life skill. It helps you really think critically about things. You know, is this really the way? How can we look at this through a different lens? You know, it's good stuff.
Okay, so we've had a great discussion tonight. It was awesome. Thank you so much, Catherine, for sticking around for the Q&A. Thank you to all those who participated tonight. And I hope that you're able to attend the remaining lectures in the series.